A mustang horse, chained and left to die in the wilderness, faced a seemingly cruel fate with no one to help and bears closing in. However, what happened next would change everything you thought you knew about survival, courage, and hope. When the world abandoned him, this horse found a way to fight back against the odds, the wilderness, and even the man who had forsaken him. Prepare for a story of resilience that will leave you breathless. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us share more inspiring stories like this with you. In the dense, shadowy forests of Montana, the sun had just begun to dip behind towering pines, casting long, eerie shadows over the land. A mustang, once a proud and powerful creature, now lay trembling and weak in the cold underbrush. His name was Dust, but at that moment, he felt stripped of all hope. Dust had been abandoned by a man he once trusted, a farmer who had cared for him but grew impatient with the mustang's illness. When Dust fell sick, the farmer, unable to bear the burden of caring for a sick animal, made a decision that would alter everything. He chained Dust by the neck to a thick, weathered tree deep in the forest, leaving him to die alone. The forest, once a place of freedom and adventure, had now become Dust's prison. The chains dug into his skin, and every breath was a struggle. His body ached, not just from the illness ravaging him, but from the cruel, suffocating chains binding him to the earth. Yet Dust was not entirely alone. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional growl of a predator filled the air. Dust's heavy eyelids threatened to close, but he lifted his head one last time, hoping for a miracle. Instead, he sensed the approach of bears. A grizzly bear, foraging for food, caught wind of Dust's scent. With a growl, it moved closer, powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Dust was too weak to move, too sick to fight. The predator's eyes glittered with hunger, its paws heavy with the intent to claim this defenseless creature as prey. Just as the bear was about to strike, something unexpected happened. The forest stillness shattered with a voice Dust recognized but had nearly forgotten in his agony. It was a voice that once offered comfort and security, a voice promising care. "Hey, get away from him." The figure emerging from the shadows was a small but determined woman named Clara. She had known Dust for most of her life and had once volunteered on the farmer's land, helping with the horses. When Clara heard rumors of Dust's disappearance, she felt compelled to find him. Her heart told her something was terribly wrong. Clara's heart raced as she approached the bear, who paused, sensing a challenge. She raised her arms, shouting again to appear larger and more intimidating. The bear hesitated, instincts urging it to retreat. Clara's eyes locked onto Dust's, and in that moment, she recognized the raw pain reflected in his gaze. This was no longer merely a rescue mission. It was a fight for survival. The bear growled once more but eventually turned and retreated into the trees. Clara rushed to Dust's side, her hands trembling as she worked to free him from the chains. He barely reacted, too weak to respond. As she finally released him, she whispered words of comfort, promising that he would never be alone again. Despite his frailty, Dust gently nuzzled her. He was still alive, but not for long if she didn't act quickly. Clara hesitated for a moment, but her years of volunteering at animal shelters and working with horses fueled her determination. Dust, though barely conscious, was a fighter, and she could see that in his eyes. She couldn't let him down. With gentle hands, she cradled Dust's face, whispering, "I got you now. You're not alone anymore." Her soft voice carried a strength that Dust could sense even in his weakened state. The bond between them was instant and undeniable, built over years of unspoken trust. However, rescuing Dust was only the beginning. Clara needed to get him to safety, which meant traveling back through the forest to the nearest veterinary clinic. The journey would be grueling, but Clara was determined to save him. She struggled to help Dust onto his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. Each step seemed more painful than the last. Clara's heart ached for him, but she couldn't afford to succumb to despair. She wrapped a thick rope around his neck and gently pulled him along the narrow trail leading back to civilization. The forest, once serene and inviting, now felt like a dangerous labyrinth. The path was rough, and the terrain unforgiving. Clara's mind raced as she calculated each step. The wind picked up, and the sky darkened, as if nature itself was testing her resolve. But she pressed on. She couldn't stop now. As hours passed, Clara felt the weight of Dust's suffering pressing against her chest. Exhaustion crept into her muscles, but she pushed through. Dust stumbled again, trembling, but instead of pulling on the rope, Clara crouched beside him, resting her hand gently on his shoulder. "You're strong," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. I know you're strong." The forest was disturbingly quiet. No birds sang, and there was no rustling of leaves in the breeze. The silence felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to occur. Dust snorted softly, lifting his head for the first time in hours, his dark eyes locking onto Clara's. It was a small act, but it sparked a flicker of hope in Clara's heart. They were in this together. Clara understood that the toughest part lay ahead. The veterinary clinic was still miles away, and Dust's condition was worsening. She had no choice but to move forward, praying that the worst wouldn't happen before they reached safety. The clouds above had thickened, and the wind howled as if nature itself was issuing a warning. Yet Clara chose to ignore it. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she pressed on, knowing Dust needed her now more than ever. The world outside the forest represented hope, but it felt as far away as the stars. Clara's determination was the only thing propelling them forward. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, a distant light appeared through the trees, a small cabin, a sign of civilization. The vet clinic was just beyond it, and Clara's heart swelled with relief. She had made it, but she feared Dust might not hold on much longer. Clara's legs burned. Each step felt like it could be her last. The cabin's light flickered like a beacon of hope, yet it seemed to recede the closer she got. Exhaustion overwhelmed her, but she couldn't stop. Dust was relying on her. As they neared the cabin, Clara heard footsteps, quick and purposeful. The door swung open, revealing a tall, older man with graying hair. He looked at them with immediate concern, his gaze fixed on Dust, who struggled to stay on his feet. "Is he all right?" The man's voice was rough but urgent. "He's barely hanging on," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "I need help, please." Without another word, the man stepped aside, allowing Clara and Dust to enter. She guided the exhausted mustang into a small room filled with the faint smell of antiseptic and hay. A table occupied the center, with various tools neatly arranged nearby. The man, Clara realized was a veterinarian, wasted no time. He immediately began examining Dust with practiced hands. Clara stood back, trying to control the panic that threatened to engulf her. She had done all she could to get him here. Now it was in the vet's hands. For what felt like hours, the veterinarian worked in silence, occasionally muttering to himself. Clara couldn't tear her gaze away from Dust, whose breathing had become shallow and uneven. She whispered his name, hoping he could hear her. "Hang in there, Dust. You're going to make it." Finally, the vet stepped back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He met Clara's gaze, his expression serious yet not devoid of hope. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The good news is there's no major organ damage. With the right care, he can recover." Clara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You're sure?" He nodded. "It won't be easy, but he's strong. He fought hard to get here. I believe he has the will to live." The relief that washed over Clara felt like a tidal wave crashing down on her. For the first time since Dust had been trapped in the forest, she allowed herself to breathe. She looked at the mustang, his eyes now half open, and felt a bond between them stronger than words could express. In the following days, Clara stayed by Dust's side, helping to nurse him back to health. The vet clinic became their refuge, a sanctuary from the horrors Dust had faced. Clara was there for every feed, every small step forward, and every sign of progress. She spoke to him softly, always encouraging, reminding him that he was not alone anymore. Dust began to regain strength, though it was a slow process. His legs, once shaky and uncertain, grew more stable. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, began to shine with the spark of life again. Clara's heart swelled with pride as she watched him recover, and their bond deepened with each passing day. Yet even as Dust grew stronger, Clara knew the hardest part of his journey was still to come. The scars of his abuse would take time to heal, both physically and emotionally. The emotional toll of being abandoned by those who were supposed to care for him wouldn't vanish overnight. But Clara was committed. She would be there for him, no matter what. One evening, as Clara sat beside Dust in the small paddock behind the cabin, she noticed him standing a little taller, a bit more confident. He had taken his first few steps on his own, and they were steady. "You're doing it, Dust," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be okay." Dust turned his head toward her. His dark eyes were soft and filled with trust. For a moment, it felt as if the world had stopped moving. The bond between them was stronger than ever, built not only on survival but on the promise of a new beginning. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Clara understood that their journey together had only just started. Days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself rising early each morning to care for Dust. The clinic had transformed into more than just a healing place. It had become home. She spent every waking moment with the Mustang, watching him regain strength and, more importantly, rediscover his trust in humans. However, challenges lay ahead. Clara had hoped that once Dust regained his health, she could find him a peaceful sanctuary where he could roam free, away from the cruelty he had endured. Yet finding the right place proved more difficult than she had expected. The world outside the small clinic was still fraught with uncertainty. Clara knew Dust could never return to the wild. He had been too conditioned by his past. He needed care, love, and a stable environment to thrive. Unfortunately, the rescue centers she contacted all had the same response. They were full, and there was no room for a horse like Dust. That's when the reality of her situation hit her hard. She had to make a choice. She could either go back to her life in the city or stay and fight for Dust, striving for a future where he wouldn't just be another sad story of neglect and abandonment. One evening, as Clara sat on the edge of Dust's stall watching him graze in the fading light, she realized there was no choice to make. She couldn't leave him now. They had come too far together. She had promised him when she first rescued him, and she intended to keep that promise. The thought of bringing Dust home with her was overwhelming. She didn't know where she would keep him or how she would care for him, but she knew she couldn't abandon him after everything they had been through. "I'm not going anywhere, Dust," Clara whispered, rushing her hand through his mane. "We'll figure this out together." As she stood up and dusted herself off, Clara heard a truck approaching. She turned toward the gate and saw a familiar face, Jackson, the vet from the clinic. He was carrying a box of supplies and wore a concerned expression. "I've been thinking about you too," Jackson said as he walked toward Clara. "I know you're trying to figure things out. There's a sanctuary a few hours from here. It's not fancy, but they specialize in horses like Dust. I've spoken to them, and they're willing to take him in." Clara's heart skipped a beat. This was the news she had been waiting for. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "It's really going to be okay for him there?" Jackson nodded, a kind smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "They have the experience and the space. I think it will be good for him. He'll be with other horses and will receive proper care." A wave of relief washed over Clara. She realized that this was the right step for Dust. As much as she had hoped to keep him, she understood that he needed more than she could provide alone. This was his best chance at living the life he deserved. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for helping him." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's what we do. He's a survivor, Clara, and so are you." The next day, Clara prepared Dust for the journey ahead. The sun barely rose, casting a golden light over the fields as they loaded him into a trailer. His once frail body now exuded quiet strength, his coat shining with health. Clara held her breath as the trailer door closed, her heart aching at the thought of leaving him behind. Yet, as the truck drove away, she knew this was just the beginning. Dust was on his way to a new life, one filled with hope, freedom, and the kind of love he had always deserved. Clara, too, was starting a new chapter, one where she could continue to fight for the animals who needed her. As the truck disappeared from view, Clara wiped away a tear, her heart full. She had done it. She had saved Dust, and now he had a future. No matter where life took her next, she would never forget the Mustang who had changed everything. Months passed, and the memory of Dust's journey lingered in Clara's heart like an unspoken promise. She had visited the sanctuary where Dust now lived, and what she saw filled her with both joy and sorrow. Dust had transformed. His coat was glossy, his muscles strong, and his once hesitant steps were now confident and sure. However, there was a sadness in his eyes, a trace of the abandonment he had once endured. Clara couldn't deny that her heart ached every time she saw him, knowing she couldn't offer him the life he had now found. Yet there was more to Dust's story than anyone could have anticipated. One afternoon, Clara received a phone call from the sanctuary. It was Jackson, the same veterinarian who had helped Dust recover. "Clara, you need to come by the sanctuary as soon as you can," Jackson said, his voice tight with concern. "Something's happened with Dust. We're not sure yet, but it's serious." Clara's heart dropped, and panic seized her chest. "What happened? Is he okay?" "We don't know yet. He's been acting strange all morning, and now he's refusing to eat. We've been monitoring him, but he's not responding like he should." Without hesitation, Clara dropped everything and rushed to the sanctuary, her mind racing with thoughts of Dust and everything he had endured. She couldn't bear the thought of him suffering again after all they had fought for. Upon arrival, she found Dust lying down in the shade of a large oak tree, his once bright eyes dull and distant. He barely lifted his head as she approached, and the sight filled Clara with dread. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "What's going on?" "Talk to me, Dust. You've been through so much. You can't give up now." Jackson walked over, his brow furrowed with worry. "He's not physically sick. We checked him over, and he's not in pain. But he's been off for days now, withdrawn and quiet. We're not sure what's causing it." Clara sat beside him, gently stroking his mane. She couldn't understand it. Dust had been thriving, so why was he withdrawing into himself? Then it hit her. It wasn't his body that needed healing anymore. It was his heart. Dust hadn't just been abandoned by his previous owner. He had been left alone in the world. He had learned to trust Clara, but he was still battling the shadows of his past. The trauma had become woven into the very fabric of his being. Clara realized that Dust wasn't just physically healing. He needed time, patience, and love to heal emotionally. She stayed with him for hours that day, talking softly, brushing his coat, and letting him know he was safe. She whispered promises to him, assuring him that no one would ever hurt him again and that she would always be there. Slowly, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dust's breathing began to steady. His ears perked up, and finally he nuzzled her hand, the quietest gesture of trust Clara had ever received from him. Jackson watched from a distance, his face softened by understanding. "He just needs time," he said, his voice calm. "He's not giving up, Clara. He's just been through too much." Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew Dust was stronger than anyone could understand. He had fought through his past and pain, and now he was on a path to recovery that no one could take from him. The next day, Clara made a decision. She would stay at the sanctuary for as long as it took. Dust needed her, and although the road ahead might not be easy, she was ready for whatever came next. She visited him every day, sitting with him, talking to him, and providing the support he needed to move forward. It was no longer just about physical healing. It was about healing together, one step at a time. Weeks passed, and Dust began to flourish once more. His spark returned, and the old joy that had once filled his eyes was coming back. He would run across the pasture, his hooves pounding the earth in a rhythmic beat of a mustang who knew freedom. But it was more than just physical recovery. It was emotional rebirth. Clara stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Dust run with the other horses, his spirit untamed and unbroken. She smiled to herself, knowing this wasn't the end of their journey, it was just the beginning. As the sun set behind the hills, Clara whispered to the wind, "You made it, Dust. You found your freedom." Dust was thriving more than anyone, including Clara, could have imagined. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his muscles rippled with strength as he galloped across the fields. Every day, he grew more confident, more like the horse he was always meant to be. Yet despite his recovery, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Dust's story, a chapter still unfinished, a part of his past that needed closure. She had been visiting him at the sanctuary for months, and with each passing week, he had grown more attached to her. The bond they shared was unspoken yet undeniable. She had been his savior and protector, and in return, Dust had become her greatest source of strength. One morning, as Clara prepared to leave the sanctuary after spending the day with Dust, Jackson pulled her aside. "Clara, there's something I think you should know," he said, his voice serious. "We've gotten a call. A man claims to be Dust's original owner. He's asking for him back." Clara's stomach churned. She hadn't expected this. The thought of Dust being returned to the cruel man who had once abandoned him seemed unthinkable. "What does he want with Dust?" Clara asked, her voice tight with anger. Jackson hesitated before answering. "He says he wants to make things right, but from what I've gathered, this man isn't exactly trustworthy." Clara's heart raced. She knew what needed to be done, but it wouldn't be easy. Dust had come so far, and he had finally found a place where he belonged. The idea of him being taken away to endure who knew what kind of treatment was unbearable. "I'll go with you to meet him," Clara said, determination rising in her chest. If this man truly wants to make things right, he needs to understand just how much Dust has been through. "I won't let him take him without a fight." Jackson nodded, his face set in grim lines. "Let's see what he has to say, but be careful. I don't trust him." They drove to the address provided by the man who claimed to be Dust's owner. The area was remote, far from the sanctuary and the safe, peaceful place that Dust now called home. Clara's gut twisted with unease as they pulled up to a dilapidated barn. It was clear that this wasn't the place of a man who had any real intention of caring for Dust. A man in his mid-40s stood outside, smoking a cigarette. His face was rough, his eyes cold, and his posture suggested he wasn't the type to back down easily. "You must be Clara," the man said, his voice gruff. "I'm Tom, Dust's rightful owner." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Anger surged within her, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm Clara. I've been caring for Dust for months now, and I can tell you right now, he's not going anywhere." Tom's eyes narrowed, and he flicked his cigarette to the ground. "You don't get to decide what happens to him. He's mine, and I'm taking him back." Clara stood her ground. "You don't get it, do you? Dust isn't just yours. He's a living, breathing being who has been through hell, and I won't let you take him back to that." Tom stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You think I don't know what happened to him? I had my reasons for leaving him out there. He wasn't good enough for the ranch. He wasn't what I needed." Clara's blood boiled, but she didn't back down. "That's not an excuse. He's been through enough pain and suffering. He doesn't deserve to go back to someone who abandoned him." There was a long silence as the two stood face to face, the tension thick in the air. Clara's heart raced, but she stood tall, refusing to let this man intimidate her. She knew she couldn't allow Dust to return to a life of misery. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom took a step back, his expression shifting. There was something in his eyes now, perhaps a flicker of regret. "You're right," he said, his voice softer now. "I screwed up. I wasn't ready for him. I don't deserve to have him." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had expected him to argue or insist. But instead, he was acknowledging his mistakes. This wasn't the man Clara had imagined. "I never thought he'd survive, not after what happened. But if he's doing better with you, then maybe it's for the best." Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had been ready to fight for Dust with everything she had, but she hadn't expected this change in Tom's attitude. "I'll take full responsibility for Dust from now on," Clara said, her voice firm. "He's in good hands now, and he's not going anywhere." Tom nodded slowly, as if the decision had already been made. "I don't deserve him," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Maybe it's better this way." Clara didn't have time for any more words. She turned and walked back to the truck, Jackson by her side. As they drove away from the barn, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. Dust was safe, and for the first time in a long time, Clara believed everything was going to be okay. The days following her confrontation with Tom were a blur of emotions. Clara couldn't believe how close she had come to losing Dust, but the relief of knowing he was safe and no longer in the clutches of someone who didn't understand him was overwhelming. Dust had been through so much, and Clara had vowed to ensure he would never again face the neglect he had endured in the past. With time, Dust's recovery grew even more remarkable. His coat shimmered under the sun, and his once cautious, hesitant steps were now confident and strong. He no longer flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. He had come to trust Clara completely, and their bond deepened in ways neither had expected. But it wasn't just Dust who had changed. Clara found herself transformed too. Caring for Dust had brought her a sense of purpose, something she hadn't realized she was missing. She no longer felt like just a person walking through life. She felt as though she was living with intention and meaning. Each day, she felt profound gratitude for the horse who had come into her life when she needed him most. One sunny afternoon, Clara stood by the fence, watching Dust gallop freely across the field. His mane flew behind him like a flag of freedom, and his hooves pounded against the earth in perfect rhythm. For the first time, she realized just how far they had both come. Jackson walked up beside her, a small smile on his face. "You've done something incredible with him," he said, his voice warm with admiration. Clara watched Dust for a moment longer before answering. "No," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He did it. He healed himself. All I did was give him the space to trust again." Jackson nodded. "Sometimes that's all a horse needs, someone to believe in them when no one else will." Clara turned to him, her eyes soft. "I never thought I'd be the one to make a difference. I thought I was just going to be a caretaker. But it's more than that. We saved each other." Jackson smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You did. And now look at him. He's a whole new horse." Clara's chest tightened with emotion as she could see it. The spirit of the mustang was no longer hidden beneath layers of fear and pain. Dust had found his strength, and so had she. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the field, Clara walked out to where Dust stood. She reached out her fingers, brushing his soft muzzle. He nuzzled her gently, his eyes full of trust. For the first time, Clara realized that it wasn't just about saving a horse. It was about a shared journey of healing and redemption. Dust had found freedom, but so had she. The bond they shared transcended words. It was a quiet understanding, and mutual respect for the paths they had walked, paths filled with struggle, but ultimately paths that had led them to each other. "Thank you," Clara whispered softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You showed me what real strength is." Dust snorted in response, his breath warm against her skin. In that moment, Clara knew that no matter what happened in the future, she would always have him, and he would always have her. They were a team, bound by something far greater than what the world had ever tried to take from them. As the last light of day faded into twilight, Clara made a silent promise to Dust, a promise that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. No one would ever hurt him again, and no one would ever leave him behind. They were free.